So hello to Professor Bolshakov and the other conference attendees. We'd like to thank you for allowing us to make this keynote. I'd like to introduce to everyone there, those who aren't familiar, Mr. Lindon Larush, who will be giving an introduction to the presentation from his basement project, which is addressed to this conference.
Mm-hmm. We have now come into the most interesting part of this part of history, I believe. We are at the point where there's a great movement in Russia, also in China, and we would hope in the United States as well, that these three nations will come together around a devotion to a great Pacific revolution in terms of the development of the Pacific basin of the world as the new driving point for the future of humanity. And in this connection, I'm very happy to speak in memory of my old friend Pobisk and his associates, with whom we had during his lifetime a great deal of fun together under the most difficult circumstances of the aftermath of the Soviet Union during that time. We came close to winning something. We didn't win. We had hoped that President Clinton of the United States, who was interested in the cause which I represented in part for Russia's recovery, we weren't disappointed in that hope for various reasons, including the attacks on President Clinton from within his own party, and as well as the Republicans. But the time has come to review some of those intentions which we had in the post-Soviet period, the immediate post-Soviet period of the Russia today. We now have come to a time where we see an evolution past the time of Pobisk's passing from life. We see now an emerging tendency of a new form toward a convergence of Russia on the Pacific development together with China and other countries. We see a natural inclination, a historic inclination of the United States again to renew its relationship to Russia, which was primarily transatlantic in my time until recently, and has now become trans-Pacific. As Russia has moved more and more to renewing its Arctic and Pacific development, this in cooperation with China in a way which would have been thought impossible some years back. We are now looking at the same old world and many of the same old questions and issues of science and society as then, but now we look at them with a great fear because there's great danger to civilization now from all sides. There is also great reason for optimism because there has been, despite everything else, there has been a resurgence of a scientific motivation which can lead to greatness. For example, one example, we've had for a long time in the United States, since the time of when Kennedy was still president, of a commitment to what was called NWAPA, the development of a great water system covering the entire western part of North America. The United States, from Alaska down, Canada, down into the United States, and down into northern Mexico. Since that time, technology has progressed in one sense, in knowledge, though not much in practice. We've gone into a dark age, relatively, on the planet as a whole. Our efforts are now in danger. But I think by our assembling now on this occasion to which I've been invited, that we look at some of the things that our old friend Pobisk had on his agenda, which are unresolved matters left over today, and looking at those issues from the standpoint of the great challenge which implicitly the United States has potentially as a partner of Russia and China today. That by looking at those questions, and they are new questions, questions concerning space technology, questions concerning the threat to life on Earth from within the galaxy? These kinds of questions must be brought forward and discussed, because we are entering a new period of galactic history, as well as just a history of Earth. And the way to do it is to go back to our souls, which our commitment to science in those times when Pobisco was still alive, and to take up the issues of today from that starting point. And I think that is what is going to happen here at this convention, and I look forward to seeing what is produced. Thank you.
This audience may already be familiar with the recent proposals from Lindon Larush and Larush PAC for a global reorganization of the world economic system. This would involve the immediate implementation of a Glass-Steagall separation of financial speculation from the real economy, to allow us to create what is known as a credit system. This credit system would be a system of long-term credit issued by governments via international treaties directed toward the construction of large-scale infrastructure projects. These large-scale infrastructure projects will be headed up by, on the North American side, NOWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, and on the opposite side of the Pacific, a network of development projects connected to what is called the Eurasian Land Bridge, which would reach up through Russia, through Siberia, until these two projects connected at the Bering Strait. This would reopen a region of the world known as the Arctic for collaboration and economic development, and create the possibility for the generation of real, physical wealth globally. Now, anybody sane looking at this project would be in agreement with it. At the same time, most people looking at this project would not understand the actual scientific principle that underlies it. To understand this, you have to take a look at a discussion that was presented recently in a paper by Mr. Lindon Larush. To understand this principle, the one which underlies these developments, one has to understand the principle of human creativity. Human creativity in these terms is an ontological fact. It is an ontological principle of the universe. This is not something that is limited to the human individual. Just as in human ideas, any human action taken begins with a concept of the action to be taken. In a human artistic composition, what you begin with is the idea. What you begin with is a metaphor. Now, this is something to be recognized as ontological fact. We could say, in the beginning of everything was metaphor. In the beginning was the idea. This gives us a completely different structure to physical reality than you would expect from a simple reductionist mode of organization. In particular, for our purposes here, this gives us a completely different style of economics from what is presented by monetarism and Adam Smith. That is to say, the model presented by Adam Smith, the model presented by monetarism, is ostensibly an animal model. That is, it claims to be based on the method of organization of animal species. Now, we won't have the time to discuss here, though it is discussed elsewhere on our website. This model is not even adequate for animal species. Survival of the fittest is not a universal principle. Natural selection is not a universal principle. But more importantly for our purposes here, it is not in any way, shape, or form a principle of human activity. To back up, let's take a look at the long arc of evolutionary development on this planet and recognize a series of platforms, what we might call a series of nested unities in this arc of development. You have, as Vladimir Vernadsky emphasized, with life and living processes, this is the first time that you begin to see a modular structure of time. Rather than the sort of continuous progression you would get with a rock or other abiotic phenomena, with life, it is the first time you begin to see a phenomenon known as a succession of generations. This takes several forms throughout history. You begin to see first the simple repetition of single-celled organisms. As these begin to combine themselves in a process known as endosymbiosis, you begin to see higher levels of unity than the single-celled creatures. Higher than the bacterial and archaean life forms, you begin to see smaller-scaled, multi-celled organisms. These begin to group themselves again into different colonial structures. And these colonial structures combine into higher and higher levels of organizations, each of these representing a newer platform of development. As these things become more and more complex, you begin to see them enter into new types of symbioses, new types of interactions on the planet, in particular as life moves out of the ocean and onto land. But now, with the appearance of human activity on this planet, you begin to see something that is qualitatively distinct from these animal modes of behavior. You begin to see a force on the planet that can now consciously organize these types of symbioses. You begin to see an organization on the planet which for us takes the form of different types of domestication, where the human mind begins to act as a force governing the relationships between the elements of the biotic system, between the elements of the biosphere. But now that once again begins to organize itself in order to reach higher and higher levels of development. Meaning, it is not sufficient for the human species to remain a collection of creative individuals. You have to have the creation and organization of human culture. Human society must begin to consciously organize itself as a one, not within human individuals, but across human individuals. This takes the form of classical culture, classical artistic development, the classical artistic communication of ideas from individual to individual. But then, what particularly distinguishes a human species from animal species? It is the ability to link human culture across time. That is to say, only the human species is capable of being in a dialogue with individuals of that species which no longer exist, who are no longer alive. Human culture transcends both space and time as a unity. Now, this is a level of unity that has never existed before in the history of the biosphere or in the history of the universe as a whole. Not in this conscious, directed form that we see with humanity. Now, this is something that has to be facilitated. The connection of the human species across time needs to be facilitated by two types of activity. One is what we recognize as history. That is the study of human history. This allows human intention to be directed across long arcs of time. But in order to project human activity into the future, an understanding of human history and the study of human history and culture is not enough. In order to effectively express the human will, the time reversal character of the human individual creativity has to somehow be communicated to society as a whole. Human creative intention requires what is effectively the future being able to act on the present. Now, this can only be accomplished in society by the establishment of a credit system. For a society, this can only be accomplished by building the types of structures, the social structures, that are necessary for a vision of the future to be able to act back on value and activity in the present. In this way, the policies represented by Glass-Steagall and by the implementation of a credit system allows us to link human society across time. Now, that linking across time allows us to now link human society in a completely new way across space. Take a look at the rail routes that are required in order to develop the Nawapa system. The Nawapa system will represent the conscious human taming of biological cycles, biospheric cycles of the planet. This is to take the existing cycles of evaporation off the ocean, in this case off the Pacific Ocean, and to take the existing cycles of cloud formation and rainfall and to shift them, taking the large quantities of water that now currently run off into the ocean from Alaska and northwestern Canada, and to rescue that fresh water from being lost as salt water, and to redirect it down to the North American continent in order to green the great American desert shared between the United States and Mexico, as well as to provide water and power for many areas of Canada and the United States which are currently suffering. But now this will require massive infrastructure development in the state of Alaska. For this massive investment into the dams, canals, and other water management that is required in Alaska, there will have to be constructed a network of rail transportation to connect the productive centers of the United States with those regions of potential development in Alaska. This brings a level of civilization to the northern portions of North America, which has never been seen before in the history of the human species. The effect will be to have these regions leapfrog the existing developed areas of North America. We will be taking the most backwards regions and making them the most forward-looking regions. This level of infrastructure development now placed in Alaska gives us the ability to complete the Bering Strait crossing. When connected with a series of development projects which have already been proposed for Russia, Russia's Far East, and Siberia, this becomes an impressive worldwide network. This reconnecting of the world is not a simple link across the Bering Strait. Viewed as a topological phenomenon, this is a complete transformation in connectivity of the surface. Taking the phase space of human society as it is interconnected through a system of communication, transportation, transmission of resources, if you take that phase space, that physical economic phase space, what you're doing by creating this connection in the Arctic region is you are increasing the level of connectivity. And you are transforming the surface to where we are better served to view the world, no longer from the standard transatlantic view, but instead, first, from an Arctic polar view, what we might now call the center of the world, and to shift that view down to a trans-Pacific collaboration. This is an internal set of reconnections of the human species which could be mapped successfully as a tensor transformation. This transformation to a trans-Pacific mode of operation will represent the first time that you have seen the human species unified in intent globally. This is a realization of Vernadsky's noosphere for the first time in human history. This implementation of Vernadsky's noosphere positions us to approach, in a more focused way, mankind's extraterrestrial imperative. This underscores two principles of humanity. The distinction between the human mind and the human brain is much more clear when viewed from this standpoint. When humanity is treated as a set of isolated individuals, it is easy to confuse the close relationship between the human mind and the human brain. But when society is recognized as a unified society, it's possible to realize that human creativity in the human mind has to transcend the individual human physiology. It has to transcend the individual human. What we recognize as mind is now understood to be a creative force that unifies all of society. This mind facilitates its interaction with the objective universe by means of sense perceptions. When we are viewing the individual human being, these are often referred to as the 5 or more senses. But when viewed as a human society, we instead begin to refer to the human sensorium and the extended human sensorium. This contains as many senses as can be developed in the form of scientific instruments by the human species. Most significantly, our ability to act in the solar system and the galaxy is facilitated by a network which extends far out into Earth orbit and ultimately into interplanetary and interstellar space. This system, in order to be completed in a way to defend us against threats such as electromagnetic pulses from the sun and other galactic threats, such as whatever is responsible for the 62 million year periodicity of mass extinctions, this must be a collaboration between the 3 major powers of the US, Russia, and China to begin with. Only this kind of collaboration around constructing its extended sensorium will place mankind in its proper role and allow mankind to carry out its necessary extraterrestrial imperative. This invisible process of expanding, developing human creativity, human anti-entropy, is the actual principle which underlies the policy of Glass-Steagall, the implementation of a credit system, and the combined Arctic development between the US, China, and Russia. Properly understood, this principle of human creativity will represent a renaissance globally and will represent a new era for the human species. The exit from our adolescence and into our adulthood.